Kitty had great personality and was in much demand by the eligible bachelors of the town and county. As a consequence, she had a busy social life, holding parties in the drawing room of the hotel, attending dances in Granard and other parts of Longford, and travelling to Dublin for some of the top society functions. But Collins had a rival for the lovely Kitty. Harry Boland, fellow member of the Supreme Council of the IRB, and who, like Collins, would be elected in the general election of 1918. In fact, Boland and Kitty were sweethearts when Collins arrived in the Granard area, and it would be some years before Kitty would switch her affections. In April 1918, Collins was arrested near Granard for making a speech likely to cause disaffection. He was charged at Longford town and given bail. He didn't appear at the next assize and went on the run. From then until the truce 3 years later, he was a wanted man. He set up operational offices in various parts of Dublin and a network of safe houses, the homes of sympathisers who would give him food and a bed for the night. Hotels and public houses around the city also served as meeting places for the volunteers. Collins travelled openly around Dublin, riding a bicycle from one meeting place to the next. At this stage, Dublin Castle didn't have photographs of him and relied only on poor descriptions of this most wanted man. He joked and chatted with troops and detectives at frequent checkpoints. One soldier, amused by Collins's chatter, was to say to him, "Well, you're a decent sort anyway." At the first meeting of the Dáil in the Mansion House in January 1919, Michael Collins and Harry Boland were marked present. They were, in fact, in England, helping Eamon de Valera to escape from Lincoln Jail, where he and another man were being held for allegedly organising another 1916-type resurrection in Ireland. Back home again, as leader of the illegal Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, de Valera called for the raising of a public loan to support the work of the Dáil. To Michael Collins, as Minister for Finance, fell the task of launching this. He used symbolically the block on which the patriot Robert Emmet had been beheaded a century before. Relatives of those executed in 1916 were the first to buy loan bonds, queuing for this propaganda film, which would be shown in towns throughout the country. When the loan closed, £379,000 had been raised. Gold and money collected by Collins was hidden in a house on the south side of the city and smuggled out in a child's coffin. The empty coffin was discovered in a bank a few years ago. The Dáil now took on civil administration duties in defiance of Dublin Castle, including courts of law. Thousands of military reinforcements were poured in from England. Inevitably, the shooting started. The authorities now intensified their efforts to smash the Republican movement through the police force's political unit, G Division. But unknown to even most of his own people, Collins already had spies in Dublin Castle and in G Division itself. One of those was Dave Nelligan, whose first meeting with Collins was in the upstairs room of a Dublin pub.
So the publican came out and opened the private door, and I was brought upstairs to one of the rooms where there was smell of stale beer. There was a middle-aged man sitting there, an old dust coat thrown over a chair. This was the famous Michael Collins. So Joe Riley introduced me. And Collins said to me, "It's too bad about your brother getting killed." My brother was killed down in Limerick in a motorcycle accident at Goulburn Bridge. He said, "We know he was all right. We know you're all right too. I want you to go back to work for me." So I said to him, "Mr. Collins, I'd rather do anything than go back to that bloody place again. I'll join a column if necessary. I'll do anything you want me to do, but I'd rather go back to that rotten giant Dublin Castle." Listen, Dave, says he, "We have plenty of people for columns. The British trust you and we trust you. If you want to serve the cause, go back." I had no answer to that. I said I would.
Another Collins spy in the castle was, incredibly, his own cousin Nancy, who had been transferred from the post office in London to Dublin.
Sometime in late 1918, early 1919, she was called into interview by the Honourable Sir James McMahon, who was the second most senior officer in the Department of Posts and Telegraphs in Dublin. His conversation went with her something like this: "Miss O'Brien, you will understand that in this attempt to undermine the British Empire, Collins has had men who have been able to bring him information with regard to the military administration of this country. In very many instances, Collins had this information before the officers for whom it was intended got it. And Whitehall are disturbed that civil administration could also present problems if Collins got to learn of certain happenings. We've studied your career in the post office, both in London and in Dublin. And in researching it, we've found that you have no interest in these upstarts who would tilt at the might of the British Empire. You're quick at your work, and on my recommendation, it has been decided to ask you to decode the messages, certain important ones that will come from Whitehall. My mother was astounded at this, and when work was over, she immediately made contact with Michael. His first remark to her was, "Well, Christ," he said, I don't know how they've held their empire for so long and achieved so much. You must hand it to them. But what a bloody intelligence service they have, that they would ask you, my second cousin, to be the repository of their confidences."
In May 1919, another unit of Collins's secret army was to be formed, the Squad, a group which would carry out attacks and raids. But within the Squad was an elite corps, 12 young men, all volunteers, nicknamed the 12 Apostles. These were full-time assassins, posing as tradesmen, but ready to pounce whenever Collins called upon them. One of those was Vinnie Byrne.
When you joined the Squad, you weren't just going to join and fall in behind the fellow and say, "I'm a member of the Squad." You had to set yourself, the man in charge, to say, "This is your job now, get him." And they'd be all round far away, and maybe one man would be with you, and there's walking coming along, and when you get him cleared of the traffic, let him have it, then run like hell.
Collins ordered attacks on village police barracks, forcing the survivors to permanently abandon the buildings. The eyes and ears of the authorities in the rural areas were now gone. One of the British officers involved in the attempted roundup of IRA men was a fellow Irishman, Bernard Law Montgomery, Monty, who would win fame at El Alamein in the Second World War. He's photographed here, interrogating IRA suspects in County Cork. In June of 1920, Eamon de Valera began an 18-month tour of the United States to rally American support for an independent Ireland. He raised $6 million for Doyle Erin, but he ran foul of Irish-American organizations and also failed to get the necessary political support of both the Republican and Democratic parties. Michael Collins, during this period, despite the demands on his time and the dangers of moving anywhere outside Dublin, travelled regularly to this house in Greystones in County Wicklow to bring housekeeping money to De Valera's wife to support her young family.
Collins risked his life once a week to go out to Greystones to bring out money to the De Valera's when Dev was in the States to see Mrs. De Valera and the children, and to make sure that they were all right, and to play with the kids. I mean, the late Vivian De Valera, who took a great interest in the period and studied it as well as lived through it, used to tell me that, and he'd recall how Collins, when he'd be there, would play with them, and he referred to me as Uncle Nick, and he'd be sent up to the corner to keep an eye out for the black and tans to see whether they'd be coming, because an idea that an alert 12 or 13-year-old is a great scout. This is the sort of thing that the IRA had in those days, boys, girls, eyes and ears everywhere. And from everything that one gathers from the period, he seems to have had a tremendous regard for Mrs. De Valera and her family, and for De Valera himself. I mean, he'd helped to get him out personally, went over to get him out of jail in England, personally arranged to get him into the States, and personally arranged to smuggle Mrs. De Valera afterwards to the States to see him. So I think there's no doubt that
Collins had the warmest regard for him and the De Valera family for him. I think De Valera would have had a great personal relationship with him himself, and as far as politics would have allowed him, or as he saw politics allowed him, or as his vision of the thing would have allowed him, he would have tried to be warm to Michael Collins as well. Unfortunately, politics in the end got the upper hand.
By early 1920, police reinforcements were urgently needed. No previous police experience necessary. Hundreds of ex-soldiers, home from the Great War to a jobless Britain, were glad to accept the offer. They were not, as the IRA claimed, a bunch of criminals and psychotics recruited from jails, but some were criminals, and many black and tans frequently behaved as such. To the British government and those loyal to Dublin Castle, the behaviour of the IRA was no better. At short notice, it wasn't possible to provide the new recruits with complete uniforms. They wore black trousers and khaki tunics, or vice versa, and were quickly nicknamed the Black and Tans, after a well-known hunt in Limerick. They ranged unbridled to fight terror with terror, but frustrated by the hit-and-run tactics of the IRA, they committed atrocities on the civilian population which were denounced even by newspapers and periodicals in Britain. As the IRA campaign intensified, the Black and Tans were joined by another group from Britain, the Police Auxiliary Cadets. These ex-army officers also operated a scorched earth policy, burning towns and villages. But the Auxies, many of them decorated for gallantry in the recent World War, also brought a grudging respect from the IRA for their bravery in battle. Many times they fought to the last man, refusing to surrender. But another and far more deadly foe now faced Michael Collins. The year 1920 and the fighting intensified in the countryside, with flying columns of the IRA attacking military convoys and barracks, and the Black and Tans auxiliaries and army combing towns and villages for volunteers and their sympathizers. The IRA began burning the homes of property owners in retaliation for the destruction of houses by the military. Hostages were taken, and if IRA prisoners were executed, then the hostages suffered the same fate. In the midst of this tit-for-tat killing, there were incidents of chivalry. One British officer bequeathed his watch to the man who was about to execute him because the executioner, he said, was merely doing his duty. But amidst the turmoil and bloodshed, 2 deaths focused international attention on Ireland's troubles and brought further pressure on Britain. On the night of March the 19th, 1920, a party of armed men with blackened faces arrived at this shop and shot dead the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCurtain, who was also commandant of the Mid-Cork Brigade of the IRA. The killers were known to be members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, led by a district inspector. Collins had him killed later that year. At the inquest on McCurtain, the jury brought in a verdict of murder against the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, the Viceroy of Ireland, and the Inspector General of the RIC. In October of that same year, the body of McCurtain's successor, Terence MacSweeney, was taken from Brixton Prison in England, where he died after a 75-day hunger strike. Thousands of Londoners watched the procession as it made its way to the ship waiting to take the body home to Cork. MacSweeney, member of the Dáil and commandant of the 1st Cork Brigade of the IRA, had been charged with being in possession of a police cipher and of 2 documents likely to cause disaffection to His Majesty. Sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, he went on hunger strike immediately. Before his arrest, he'd said, "It's not those who can inflict the most, but those who can endure the most who will conquer."